Every day we hear about the various issues that are plaguing the various Indigenous communities across Canada. But what are these communities? What were their lives like before the European settlers? What was their languages, their culture? What actually differentiated these groups from each other? That is the question I intend to answer today. To start off, what will I actually be discussing in today's video? Today I'll be talking to you about the territorial arrangement of these people groups, their religion, their social structure, their material culture, as well as their methods of subsistence. So, territorial arrangement. Where did these various people groups live? Now, there are three actual categories or subclasses of Indigenous people based on their geographical location. The first being the Arctic peoples of Canada. The Arctic peoples of Canada live exactly where their name would suggest. They live all up along the Arctic coast of Canada and the US. They live all along the coast of Alaska, Yukon, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, as well as northern Quebec and parts of Newfoundland and Greenland. Next are the Subarctic peoples of Canada. This territory is absolutely huge. It spans all the way from inland Alaska down through the territories and the north of the Prairie provinces, as well as Ontario, Quebec, and parts of the Maritime provinces. This area is actually so huge that it includes several subdivisions within itself to differentiate between the different groups of Indians living within it. The eastern subdivision of the subarctic peoples includes everything east of Saskatchewan, and the groups found here are the Algonquin, Innu, Cree, and Ojibwe, among others. The western subdivision, on the other hand, is everything west of Saskatchewan, including inland Alaska, part of the territories, as well as the north of the Prairie provinces. The groups living here are the Athabascan peoples. The western zone is even further divided into the Pacific drainage and the Arctic drainage zones. Because of this territory's sheer size, it houses the most amount of Indigenous groups in Canada. Last but not least, we have the Northwest Coast Indians, and as their name would suggest, they live on the northwest coast of North America. These people live all along the south coast of Alaska, the coast of British Columbia, as well as the coasts of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. The Northwest Coast Indians are divided into four distinct provinces. The four provinces that make up the Northwest Coast Indians is the Northern Province, which is the coast of Alaska, the north coast of British Columbia, the Wakashan Province, which is central and southern British Columbian coast, as well as half of Victoria Island. The third is the Coast Salish Chinook Province, which is in central and southern British Columbian coast, as well as the other half of Victoria Island. Final is the Northwest California Indians. You can guess, lives in Northwest California as well as the coast of Washington and Oregon. Now, let's start actually comparing and contrasting these different aspects from these different Indigenous groups. Starting off with, how did they get their food? Now, there is obviously a severe lack of any kind of vegetation up in the north of Canada, which would mean that all the Inuit up there have to get their sustenance through either hunting, fishing, or trapping. Of particular importance to the Inuit were large aquatic animals like the walrus, the seal, and the whale. Their meat was used to feed themselves, as well as their bones were used to make tools and other pieces of art. The Inuit hunted these large aquatic mammals with specialized canoes called umiaks, which held a small hunting group along with the head of a hunting party. They used tools like harpoons, spears, and nets in order to catch these aquatic prey. Due to their reliance on these large aquatic mammals, the Inuit often lived in coastal villages dotted up along the Arctic coast, usually only moving inwards to hunt large game like caribou. By contrast, the American and Canadian subarctic house a much larger variety of both species of animal and vegetation, meaning that the subarctic Indians of Canada used both hunting and gathering techniques rather than relying overly much on fishing. The subarctic Indians of Canada obviously would hunt whatever animals were available in their respective areas. This varied greatly as the geographical area is huge, but included stuff like various birds such as goose, ducks, large game like elk and deer. Some parts there was hare, and in the Pacific drainage areas of Canada, other fishing was done as well. The western subarctic Indians actually resemble the most closely the Inuit, with them having more commonly sedentary villages where they would take advantage of rivers and game that stayed in one spot during the entire year. By contrast, the eastern subarctic Indians tend to actually move around with the seasons, following whatever herd of animal that they tended to prey upon, such as elk or deer or caribou or whatever other animal would move around with the seasons. These are the Indians we most commonly associate with the teepees. The Subarctic Indians of Canada are also the ones which are most famous for their pemmican, which was meat pounded with fat and berries in order to make a preserved meat for harsher times in the winter. Last but not least, as you might infer, the Northwest Coast Indians also lived along the coast in sedentary villages and relied mainly upon fishing, much like their Arctic counterparts. The difference between the Northwest Coast Indians and the Arctic Indians is that there was a much larger variety of fish and game available on the much warmer waters of the West Coast. This means that not only did they fish, but there was also game and berry gathering available on those shores, which also allowed for there to be a much larger variety of people groups along those shores. While you might only find the Inuit and the Aleut up in the Arctic, there are several dozen groups that live up along the Northwest Coast. In particular, along the Northwest Coast, salmon was a very important cultural and religious icon. Certain types of salmon, pink and chum salmon, were very good for preserving due to their low fat content, meaning they would spoil slower. In addition to the salmon, mussels, cod, sea otter, mackerel, and all kinds of other sea mammals and fish were available up along these shores, although salmon probably had the largest cultural significance. So to summarize, the subarctic Indians are the most different from their other two counterparts, mainly relying on hunting and gathering to get their sustenance and tending to move around with the seasons. Meanwhile, the Arctic and Northwest Coast Indians tended to stay in sedentary villages up along the coast and relied heavily upon fishing and harvesting of aquatic resources. Next, I'll discuss the social structure of these various indigenous groups. So how did their communities get organized, how did their leadership get organized, and how were their families organized? As well as how did they interact with each other, and what were their different rituals and social taboos and whatnot. Starting again with the Arctic peoples, due to the lack of a large-scale sustainable food source, the communities of these people tend to be quite small and isolated, allowing for a large variety of social structures all along the coasts of Canada and Greenland. While the culture did vary quite greatly, one sort of common thing was that there was not exactly a formal leader or chief elected among these groups. The closest thing you would usually find to a leader in any of these groups was the whaling or fishing leaders called the Umialiks. The Umialiks were often the owners of umiaks or canoes, and they tended to be the ones that recruited people to fish and hunt and provide for the village. It became sort of the unofficial chiefs or leaders of a lot of these villages. Finally, family lineage was recognized through both the mother's and the father's bloodline. Again, depending on which group you were from, it varied greatly along the entire Arctic coast. Now, to compare them to the subarctic groups, where there was much more complexity. Due to the larger amount of food available to the subarctic peoples, their communities were often somewhat larger and organized into what was called bands, which is usually communities of up to 20 to 30 people. Within these bands, you would usually find families arranged nuclearly, much like us, with sometimes there being 3 generational homes where mom, dad, kids, and also the grandparents would live together. It is also among the subarctic peoples where the idea that the land and the water belong to no one person are the most prevalent. It was generally understood that when one band was presently taking advantage of a piece of land, then nobody else would come into the area, but otherwise no ownership of land was ever formally recognized. Within these bands, marriages were founded upon agreement between the parents of the bride and the groom, meaning arranged marriages. Usually the bride and groom's feelings for each other were taken into account, but obedience to parental choices was very much expected. As with most cultures in the world, there was a large taboo against incest in these marriages. Although cross cousins, so your mom's brother's kids or your father's sister's kids, were considered to be ideal mates. In contrast to the Arctic peoples of Canada, the subarctic peoples actually did usually have some kind of leadership position, often in the form of a chief. Finally, due to the sheer abundance of food and resources along the northwest coast, the Northwest Coast Indian communities and groups were considered to be some of the most culturally and socially developed of all the three groups. These communities of the Northwest Coast Indians were often compared to the noble houses of medieval Europe. Each of these noble houses or elite families tended to control one or another important resource, such as certain property or ritualistic grounds, or certain beneficial hunting grounds or fishing grounds, some kind of privilege that the others did not possess. Some less tangible privileges were also available to each respective house. Privileges like uses of certain symbols or certain crests or certain names. While already talking about privilege, these communities were often divided into sort of three social categories. The first and highest up being the ruling elite of the communities, the second being the commoners or just the normal folk, and the third and lowest rung of the social ladder being the war captives or slaves. When compared to their Arctic and subarctic counterparts, the population sizes of each of these communities was absolutely huge. The main productive unit of a single house within a community was often a few dozen up to 100 members. Now, how was your social rank actually kind of determined? Usually it was determined through your relatedness to a founding member of a community or house, though you could actually move up in social status by marrying or having children with a person of a status above you. The absolute highest rank you could have among these communities was the chief. The chief was the highest social rank who controlled the group's properties and had a large say in how, where, and when food was to be caught and hunted. He was also responsible for deciding when to perform ceremonies, rites, and feasts, as well as controlled relations with other similar communities. With these privileges, though, the chief was expected to administer and grow the group efficiently. So with all the privileges that came with the chief, he also had a large amount of responsibility towards his group. While the chief's decisions were normally held in high regard, oftentimes you could have the other mature members of the community weigh in on his decisions, and often did, because all of the property of the community was held in common between everybody, meaning that the decisions of the chief could definitely affect everyone else, so everyone else had a say in the affairs of the community. In terms of actual familial lineage, in the northern provinces, the passing on of titles, land, status, etc. was passed down by the mother, though in the southern provinces, things were the reverse, with the father's lineage usually being the dominant one. Arctic peoples were the least socially developed group among these three categories. They didn't have a formal chief, and they tended to have very small communities in comparison to the other two groups because of their lack of food resources. The subarctic peoples were more socially developed because of their larger variety of food available to them across the entire continent. As well, they had actually a formal chief, as well as they tended to be a more mobile group of people, hunting and gathering and moving with the seasons. Finally, the Northwest Coast Indians, with the largest abundance of food, were the most socially developed, having much larger populations in each community, and having a social and cultural development not dissimilar to that of medieval Europe at the time of their discovery. In this particular case, the correlation is clear. Access to more hospitable lands and more food means more social development and larger population. Moving on, we will now be talking about the religious and spiritual beliefs and what were the similarities and differences between these beliefs between these groups. Religion and spirituality is easily the most similar thing between all of these groups. All of these different groups believed in some form or another of animalism and reincarnation. All of these groups believed that every living being had some kind of a soul or essence, and that when a being died, its soul or essence would leave and then come back and sort of reincarnate into the same animal. In all of these groups, because of this belief in reincarnation, they believed that every animal that they killed had to be honored and respected. Otherwise, these animal spirits would feel disrespected and offended and would not come back and would not reincarnate as the same animal, causing poor hunting seasons and possible starvation and famine among their people. Because of this, each and every group had different ceremonies and rituals and whatnot they would use to honor and give thanks to these animals for giving their lives, so that they, the humans, could have food to eat, and then they could sustain their communities. The only differences here were mainly in the rituals themselves, which varied from community to community and from people group to people group. As well, the actual animals that each group considered sacred changed according to where you were. For example, the Northwest Coast Indians, because of their large reliance on salmon, had a high reverence for it, believing that salmon were actually supernatural beings that took their fish form once a year to come specifically in order to feed their people and to sacrifice themselves so that their communities could go on. The last sort of commonality between all the religions is shamanism. Shamans were spiritual and religious leaders that were thought to have a stronger connection with the spirit world. Shamans were often responsible for conducting rituals that were meant to honor and respect these prey animals. And shamanism is the one big common religious sort of belief across all of the indigenous groups. Finally, we have to talk about the art or material culture of each and every one of these groups. Each group obviously used whatever resources were available to them in order to create whatever pieces of art, carvings, what have you, at their disposal. For example, the Arctic peoples, they did not have access to any kind of wood or really colors or anything that they might use to make art. So they usually made carvings out of animal bone from the animals that they had hunted, or they made the famous inukshuks out of the stones they found. The common theme throughout most of the art and material culture made by the indigenous groups is that they were all usually related to their spiritual beliefs of animalism. Their carvings and sculptures and whatnot often represented some kind of stories or animals or the spirits of animals that they were trying to honor. In particular, the Northwest Coast Indians, being the most or one of the most socially and culturally developed groups of the three, made extensive carvings and had all kinds of art. They were considered to be, out of the three, the most sort of artistically oriented group. It was from these Northwest Coast Indians that we actually get these famous artistic items like totem poles. And then also they made extensive decorations on everything they owned, which is why people tended to call them the most artistically oriented of the three groups. People have found everything from baskets to bows and arrows to spears, just covered in carvings or paintings representing their various spiritual figures, especially sacred animals like salmon. So to sort of summarize everything I've just told you, religion is probably the most similar thing across all the different cultures. Practices of animalism and shamanism are very common across all three subgroups, as well as their respect and sort of reverence towards animals and reincarnation. In that same vein, the material culture is sort of the next most similar thing. While the actual designs and materials used to create these various artistic pieces might vary between the different groups, they all sort of follow a central theme, which is depicting sort of their spiritual or religious icons and animals. From there, the most different thing about all these groups is their social structure / organization. This actually does make sense if you take into account the geography of where they live. Each of these groups lives in such different climates, they live far apart from each other in isolated pockets, that it would make sense that different social structures and social strategies would arise in order to tackle the different climates and environments each group found themselves in. Now that I've basically vomited all this information at you about culture and religion and whatnot about the indigenous groups, you might be asking, what issue or what positive change initiative could I possibly come up with when there isn't really an issue that was presented here? And that's sort of the issue, actually. All this information that I've given you, I've gathered from all kinds of sources, from books to the internet, but there isn't really one centralized database or archive or resource that can tell you all these things in one place that I was able to find. Therefore, my proposal for a positive change initiative would be to create some kind of an online resource that details all the things I've just told you about these various First Nations, and in even more detail, because what I've been telling you is just like the general overview, and as you can see, that is a lot of information to take in. So having an archive or a database or some kind of an online resource where it tells you everything I just told you, but in one location, and even more specifically about each group, from the Ojibwe to the Cree to the Salish to everybody else. Having all this information in one place will make it much easier for both Canadians and Indigenous people alike to actually learn about the history of the Indigenous people in Canada, and might help cure some ignorance about their culture, or might perhaps help to educate people who are interested about them. It might even help Indigenous people themselves who have maybe lost their sense of identity or don't know about their own culture. It's a very useful tool that should be available. In any case, I hope I have piqued your interest into the histories and cultures of the various Indigenous groups of Canada with this video. I encourage you all to go and watch more of these related types of videos, and also do your own research on the internet. But in the meantime, I hope you all enjoyed this video, and have a nice day. Peace out.